B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Monday, September 25th, 2017. In a gross miscalculation driven by his ego and his delusions of power, Donald Trump started an attack on Friday night against sports figures who declined to stand for the national anthem. And, oh, has he opened up a hornet's nest. Now, this began Friday night at a rally that Trump should not have taken anyway, because it appears that his trip to Alabama to support temporary Senator Luther Strange against an even worse guy, Roy Moore, the former Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court. Trump was hoping, and he even openly speculated from his podium there at this rally-style event in Alabama, that unless people rally to him and reject Roy Moore, who is much more in the style of Donald Trump, at least as he presented himself to voters a year ago. But Trump is instructing his loyalists to overlook that and to vote for Luther Strange, who is now essentially seen as a Washington insider. And this puts a lot to test for Trump. But we'll see how the Senate race turns out, and we'll be able to evaluate if his risky behavior paid off. But he doubled down with veiled attacks on Colin Kaepernick and Steph Curry. They're both Bay Area athletes. Kaepernick, the former quarterback of the 49ers NFL team, he's now unemployed, and as we'll get to in a moment, he appears to be nuclear, and no NFL team is willing to touch him. That may change because of the events this weekend, which are the exact opposite of what Trump hoped for. So he was trying to divide the players from the owners. And in his speech, or his ad lib on Friday night, he basically said that an owner should, if somebody takes a knee or refuses to stand during the Star-Spangled Banner, that patriotism should be enforced by firing those sons of bitches. And the escalation of the name-calling, the insult, and this style of rhetoric is something that shows how massively out of control this man is. And so the response was predictable. Steph Curry and the Warriors had been talking about whether they should accept the traditional honor as the NBA champs of going to the White House for a photo op. And Steph Curry said he didn't want to go. The team hadn't made a complete decision. But then in a tweet on Saturday morning, Trump withdrew the invitation to the Golden State Warriors to come to the White House. And this led the coach, Steve Kerr, to say, we didn't want to go anyway, and this was just a lose-lose situation. But we wish we could have had some dialogue about it first. Then the reaction on Sunday, as something like 14 games were the scene for various styles. Some teams stayed in the locker room until the anthem was complete. Some took the field, and nobody knelt, but they all stood linked arms. And a record number of players took the proverbial knee. And it's interesting how that phrase is creeping into the American lexicon now. Taking a knee has a very specific meaning. And what is most interesting, and I credit Sean King, he is the fiery African-American columnist, used to work for, I think it was the New York Post, and he recently moved to The Intercept. And he pointed out, I think he just nails it here, NFL owners and executives who protested Donald Trump are the biggest hypocrites yet. So Sean King makes a strong case that the president should have been paying more attention to the Puerto Rican victims of Hurricane Irma. But instead, he was dabbling in racism, trying to stoke division in this country, and he thought that he could drive a wedge between the players and the owners. But he didn't know how hypocritical the owners are actually capable of being. So Sean King recites some of the history about Colin Kaepernick, and I have a lot of respect for Kaepernick. He's had an uneven career as a starting quarterback. Went to the Super Bowl early in his tenure with the 49ers, didn't win, and then never really got his mojo back. And for many people, that's incidental. But as a non-football fan, I guess I feel compelled to observe that his status as a player can be passed off as a performance issue as opposed to his political expression. I don't buy that, but I'm just saying that unfortunately he is vulnerable to that kind of rationale by people who object, and they are super patriots who believe that if you go to a football game, it is somehow an expression of your support for the good old U.S. of A. But Sean King, based on reporting by another journalist who interviewed 7 owners or top executives of NFL teams, said that, well, these people are so hypocritical because one general manager told this reporter, Mike Freeman, speaking of Kaepernick, that he estimated a clear majority of NFL front offices genuinely hate him and can't stand what he did kneeling for the national anthem. They want nothing to do with him. They won't move on. The same general manager went on to say that many of the other team's executives are afraid to put Kaepernick on their roster because Trump will tweet about the team. And that's a fair concern these days. One general manager summed up the feeling among NFL team executives. In my career, I have never seen a guy so hated by front office guys as Kaepernick. All 7 team executives interviewed by Freeman for the piece said they believe 90 to 95% of NFL front offices agreed with these harsh views of Kaepernick. Not a single team has signed him, not even for the league minimum, not for a backup or third-string position. He didn't even get the chance to audition in a workout with any team over the summer. He has effectively been banned from the NFL by owners and managers who hate his guts. Like they do traitors and murderers, says King. And so when you see the team owners who took to the field, some of whom issued press statements kind of vague, they didn't quite single out Trump for criticism, they didn't quite single out Kaepernick for praise, but they talked about how divisive this is and the football is so unifying. And, of course, nobody's talking about the deadly danger that players face from head injuries and traumatic brain injuries that Trump was also tweeting about, saying that this is ruining the game. He's essentially embracing more barbaric head bashing on the AstroTurf of the NFL. So back to Sean King. Quote, what the NFL players did yesterday was genuine, real solidarity with one of their own. But what most of those team owners and managers did was marketing. It was, in the words of ESPN's Howard Bryant, performance art. It looked and felt real, but was as counterfeit as a $3 bill. As long as Kaepernick in the prime of his career is unemployed, they clearly lack the courage of their convictions. Kaepernick should have been on the field yesterday. And Colin Kaepernick's quiet bravery has sparked a movement that refuses to die. And what I wonder is if when people see Trump engaged in this kind of gratuitous insult and invective and intentionally dividing people, do they see the risk of what he did last week at the United Nations? And he followed up on Twitter. He's still tweeting about North Korea and Kim Jong-un. And this reached a new level of concern today as North Korea described that his comments at the UN amounted to a declaration of war, and as such, the recent, what's the right word, muscular flyovers by American military planes, not over North Korean airspace, but getting right up next to it, on the ocean side and on the South Korean 38th parallel border. Well, Kim, through his foreign minister, announced today that because of Trump's alleged declaration of war, quote, since the United States declared war on our country, we will have every right to make countermeasures, including the right to shoot down United States strategic bombers, even when they are not inside the airspace border of our country. And what's phenomenal to me is that the corporate media coverage of this since Trump's speech on Tuesday at the UN often will cite the reaction of Kim Jong-un or a spokesperson for North Korea without referencing the outrageous nature of the threats and insults that were hurled from the UN podium by our dear tweeter. It's just kind of, look at this mad dog in I guess we can't say mad dog because the Secretary of Defense owns that little sobriquet, but we characterize Kim Jong-un as unhinged when our unhinged president went after him, and he is responding. And this is very dangerous because this escalation of tensions and Trump's arrogance and his sense that he knows better than everybody else, that his judgment, his brilliance is so overwhelming that he doesn't need to take advice from anybody. Well, at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, J.H. Koo, director of the U.S. Korea Institute, says, I think they're dangerously close to some kind of a conflict with North Korea. This is something I feared. When we go down this road, our escalation could lead to accidental shootouts, and it may not be so accidental. And as I've pointed out repeatedly, and Colin Powell, the former Secretary of State and celebrated American general, I don't celebrate him, but other people do, he gave a speech at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor last week saying, hey, the best thing we could do is ignore Kim. And Trump's elevation of Kim to the level of the United States, to treating him as a player on the world stage, is a huge mistake. And even if Trump, flames out and somehow we are relieved of his service, the damage has been done, and it will linger for the foreseeable future. And Julie Hirschfeld Davis, writes in the New York Times today that Trump repeated his taunt in a tweet late Saturday, threatened that Kim and his foreign minister won't be around much longer if they continue their invective against the United States. And she says his willingness to casually threaten to annihilate a nuclear-armed foe is another reminder of the steep risks inherent in his brute force approach to diplomacy. You can't call this diplomacy. She says the ambiguity could be strategic, part of an effort to intimidate Mr. Kim and keep him guessing. That is extremely generous. Or, she says, it could reflect a rash impulse by a leader with little foreign policy experience to vent his anger and stoke his supporters' enthusiasm. I can go along with that. And a new poll shows that 37% of adults trust Trump a great deal or a good amount to responsibly handle the situation, while 42% trust him not at all. So, yeah, he has successfully divided the American people on issue after issue. And it's interesting to note the L.A. Times reported late on Friday that senior aides to Trump repeatedly warned him not to deliver a personal attack on Kim Jong-un at the UN, saying that insulting the young despot in such a prominent venue could irreparably escalate tensions and shut off any chance for negotiations to defuse the nuclear crisis. Now, these are the generals, McMaster, the new White House Chief of Staff, and, of course, Mattis at the Pentagon. And they're the ones we're told are going to restrain this guy and school him in the right way to handle these kinds of situations. And specifically, we have to assume this is based on leaks, but the written text of Trump's UN speech, the teleprompter feed, did not include the reference to Rocket Man on a suicide mission or his threat to totally destroy North Korea. So he improvised this. He ad-libbed it. He decided that his attitude, that his brilliance is greater than his advisors. And this is the real signal that this guy will implode. It's just a matter of what will it take and what price will we pay. Lead editorial in Sunday's New York Times. Headline, Mr. Trump squanders the world's trust. And it ends this way. A bellicose stance toward Iran is just one part of the incoherent and inconsistent foreign policy that Trump described to the UN General Assembly. He elevated sovereignty as his guiding principle for international relations, used it as a rationale for threatening Iran, North Korea, Venezuela. Given the standard that Trump is setting for foreign policy reversals, his own decisions could eventually be overturned by his successor. But the damage to America's standing as a trusted, reliable partner won't be so easily repaired. And in an interesting op-ed that is unusual for American media today, because it offers some real history about North Korea and context for this current Cold War in the making. And Blaine Harden, who has written the book King of Spies, The Dark Reign of America's Spymaster in Korea, he explained that going back to the Korean War right after World War II, that the founder of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, was such a terrible military leader that he was on the verge of losing the whole shooting match when China intervened and saved his bacon. And so Harden suggests that Kim Jong-un really knows the true history of North Korea's failures. Maybe he's overcompensating. But Harden is hoping that that knowledge will prevent the kind of nuclear exchange that many people now fear. And toward the end of the piece, Harden writes, Trump should holster his fire and fury and cease uttering what Kim Jong-un accurately describes as unprecedented rude nonsense. Instead, Washington needs to settle in for an extended Cold War with the Kims, strong military preparedness, energetic spying, flexible sanctions, quiet negotiations with China and Russia, and openness to conversations at whatever level is possible with North Koreans. It would help if Washington made unilateral gestures, accept a North Korean ambassador in Washington, if possible send an ambassador to Pyongyang, acknowledge the heinous bombing of cities in the Korean War, try to help the North Korean people feel as if the world is not against them. But Trump is too much of an idiot, and he only listens to himself and people who agree with him. And this is going to lead to an ugly outcome. I can't predict what it will be, but it's not going to be pretty. Every day I like to pause for a second and thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Fine Americans like Joey Perillo, Wendy Gebauer, Tim McKay, and Janet Price. They kick in a few bucks each month. Can you do it? Can you afford it? If you answered yes, then step on up. Come to peterbcollins.com. There's a menu button no matter what you use. You pull on that, click on Become a Subscriber. It takes you to the sign-up page, and in minutes, you can make your choice about what level is comfortable for you. And a shout-out to Michelle Pasco in Sacramento. I got your check, and thank you for renewing your annual subscription with a little extra in the kitty. Trump's royal decree banning travel from certain Muslim countries has expired. We call that one 2.0. It was issued in March, and it didn't actually go into effect until the Supreme Court issued a decision, a short ruling, in late May or early June. Well, that has now expired, and Trump yesterday issued a new order indefinitely banning almost all travel to the United States from 7 countries. It doesn't kick in until October 18th, so I'm not sure what happens in the meantime. But this is more far-reaching. It is apparently finer-tuned. It has a few extra bells and whistles so that it can't be purely referred to as a Muslim ban. Trump gratuitously tossed in North Korea. Now, nobody travels to the United States from North Korea already, so that's hardly a meaningful ban. And he targeted certain groups linked to the Maduro government in Venezuela. They, too, in my view, are not too eager to travel to the United States because they probably figure they might not be allowed to return to Venezuela. So those are kind of meaningless, but the updated ban affects citizens of Iran, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Chad, and, as I mentioned, North Korea. So this is a very serious and draconian move. I've referred to it as lifting the drawbridge at Fortress America and loosening some new crocodilators in the moat. And Trump's new decree calls into question what's going to happen with the old one, but it also raises issues about, the targeting of these nations and whether ultimately the Supreme Court will approve of this revised ban. So most citizens of Chad, Libya, and Yemen will be blocked from emigrating to or visiting the United States for any reason because these countries don't have technical capability, they say, to properly vet those who seek to travel here. So this is a very serious move. And one of my concerns is that based on my knowledge of law and precedent, the president does have wide latitude to restrict immigration. This is being done for the wrong reasons, and it targets, as we've said, people from majority Muslim nations. There is no proof or evidence or even assertion that's been offered that there is a true risk to American security from allowing these types of people to transit into the United States for business purposes or to visit family members or even to hope to become a U.S. resident. And today, based on that new order and the expiration of 2.0, the Supreme Court canceled the oral arguments they had scheduled for October 10th on the 2.0 version. They didn't just wipe it out entirely, though, because the justices have asked the legal parties who were a part of the last process that's now been dismissed whether or to what extent the new proclamation renders the case moot. They asked for briefings on a question not addressed in the proclamation concerning the earlier banned suspension of our refugee program. That is scheduled to expire next month, and we are told that there will be a separate order from the Trump White House to address that. But this now throws into question whether the rulings that were in place, for example, by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals that blocked the implementation of the Trump Decree 2.0, if that will be flushed with the declaration of mootness, or if some of that will remain as part of cases for future consideration. Well, we were threatened at the UC Berkeley, right across the bay from me, that this was going to be Free Speech Week for the right. And Milo Yiannopoulos was going to be followed by Ann Coulter and then Steve Bannon and David Horowitz, and just a parade of horribles, deplorables, whose First Amendment rights I staunchly support. But because of the squirrely way that Milo Yiannopoulos used a newly formed student group to file the paperwork so that they could rent a hall and arrange for security at UC Berkeley, they played games all week long until Friday. The university basically called their bluff. But Milo nevertheless showed up on Sunday at Sproul Hall, near the area where the free speech movement was started by Mario Savio in the 1960s. And Yiannopoulos appeared to be wearing a bulletproof vest. He had a bunch of bulky garments on. He was escorted by police. He was there for a mere 15 minutes where he posed for selfies. He did try to speak at one point, but they wouldn't give him a PA system because those are the rules of engagement on the UC Berkeley campus. So he attempted to speak. He was shouted down. He took some pictures. He said he'll be back, and the tab for the University of California at Berkeley and the city of Berkeley is at least $800,000. Meanwhile, across the bay on Friday in San Francisco, Bernie Sanders spoke about Medicare for All to the National Nurses United at a conference they were holding. And in full disclosure, I've done some work for the Nurses Union. I really support their progressive politics, their very clever and creative public advocacy. Roseanne DeMoro, their executive director, is a brilliant woman. And there were no real protests or Black Bloc or Antifa who showed up to celebrate Bernie Sanders in San Francisco on Friday. Today, the referendum vote is being held in northern Iraq, where Kurds hope to get support for their goal of setting up an independent Kurdistan. And I have linked in the show file for today's podcast to a great on-the-scene report from our friend and colleague Joe Lauria, who is in Erbil. He said it's a foregone conclusion that the vote will get at least 90% support, but that will not immediately change the legal status of the Iraqi Kurdish region. And there's a lot of great information in the article. I encourage you to read it. But the bottom line is that the U.S. has cynically used Kurdish fighters to take on the Islamic State, to buttress the failed Iraqi army that we squandered billions building up. Kurdish fighters of different stripes have also been very critical to the misguided U.S. mission in Syria. And now we're not going to throw them under the bus. We're going to throw them under an armored tank because Turkey doesn't support it. Brett McGurk, the U.S. envoy who worked for Obama, I think he worked for Bush before that, he calls the referendum ill-advised, ill-timed, and lacking international legitimacy. But I heard about one sign that's posted in a Kurdish village in northern Iraq, and it says, "Independence is taken. It is not given." And I sympathize with their efforts to take it. Lock him up? ? Crown Prince Jared Kushner has been exposed for using a private email account to communicate with other present and former administration officials, according to Politico. And his defense lawyer, Abby Lowell, has confirmed that he has been doing it, but all non-personal emails are forwarded to his official address. All have been preserved, so this doesn't matter. It's nothing like what Hillary did, we will be told. It's a lot like what Hillary did. Lock him up! ! Anthony Weiner was sentenced to 21 months in prison for his sexting behavior with a teenager. Of course, this is the third time he has been exposed for his bizarre sexual compulsions. And it's really tragic. I mentioned that I have done some consulting work for the National Nurses United Union. And it was 4 or 5 years ago. We went to Washington, D.C. There was a rally on Capitol Hill. Al Franken spoke, Bernie Sanders spoke, and then comes Anthony Weiner. And he comes up to me and he noticed that all of the members of the nurses union there were wearing red scrubs. And he said, "Can you get me one of those?" And so I found a volunteer who gave up his sweaty shirt, and Anthony Weiner donned it. He went out there, he gave a fiery speech in support of single-payer, Medicare for all. Anthony Weiner was a major risk taker as a member of Congress. He stuck his neck out to promote some progressive legislation. He was terrible about the U.S. policies toward Israel. But when Anthony Weiner agreed with you, you knew he was a strong ally who would really risk his political capital. We didn't know that he was risking everything with his dangerous behavior on Twitter and his sexual urges. And finally today, Trump's new watchdog on Wall Street has removed his fangs voluntarily and is hoping and praying that we can go back to the good old days of self-regulation by the big banks and the major money institutions. And this guy, whose name is James McDonald, is going to unveil this new idea of self-enforcement in a speech at NYU tonight. We start with the shared understanding that the vast majority of businesses want to comply with the law. What utter bullshit. And, we know how the banks risked our entire economy, if not the world's, with their risky loans and the cover-ups of that back in 2007, 2008. And if you think all that has been fixed, I will mention 2 words to you: Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo was running this insidious, high-pressure sales game where their bankers were signing up people to accounts that they didn't ask for, didn't even know about, in order to meet performance goals. And this was only exposed because whistleblower employees came forward. The idea that the bank would turn itself in and submit to friendly regulation is just a fantasy. Thanks for joining me today for my daily news and comment podcast. It's available on YouTube. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you.